Hello guys, and welcome back for the 5th episode of the Angular Spring Boot course. In this episode, we are going to focus on the Spring Boot API of the Noted application. Now, this entire series is focusing more on Angular than on Spring, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to understand how the backend works in order to create and then integrate client applications like the Angular one with it. So we're going to explore the responsibilities of the Spring Boot API, and then we're going to take a look at the code and at the code structure in order to fully understand how our backend works. Before we do that though, I want to remind you that you can subscribe to the Remaining Coder channel in order to receive notifications when new tutorials are available. That being said, let's continue with the slides. So, what are the responsibilities of the Spring Boot API? So, first of all, business logic. The second one, persistence. Everything that is database related should reside in the Spring Boot application. Security. Authentication and authorization should also reside on the backend. Now, the Noted application doesn't have security enabled, but assuming that we have a larger project, the Spring Boot API is also responsible about this aspect. Then user input validation. Although we can create validation on the client side in order to give a more responsive feedback, that doesn't need to stop us from performing on the backend as well. In fact, it's mandatory to perform user input validation on the server regardless of what's happening on the client side. So user input validation is another one. And finally, the communication contracts. So the Spring Boot application will contain the REST endpoints, the REST controllers that will enable the flow of data from and towards our Angular application. Now that we know the responsibilities, I invite you to take a quick look at the code. I fired up IntelliJ and I have opened the Noted API, which is our backend project. Now, it's a basic Spring Boot application. There's nothing very fancy about it. Even if you can take a look at the POM, you can see that we just have the Spring Boot starter, we have the JPA, we have the mail dependency, the Spring Boot starter web, and an H2 database. So really this is just a standard Spring Boot application which has a couple of dependencies like JPA and email. But other than that, it's just plain old vanilla Spring Boot. Now, if you go to the Java folder, we have this package rc.noted, and this is the entry point in our Spring Boot application. Again, very default stuff, very basic. Then we have our model. So the Noted application, like I said before, it manages nodes. So it makes sense that we have a node class in here which represents our node entity, and each node can be assigned to a notebook. So a notebook can have multiple nodes, and a node can only be assigned to a single notebook. That's why we have this JPA many to one relationship in here. But after that we have ID, title, and text for the node, and the last modification date. We have a couple of constructors and then basic getters and setters. The notebook again is a JPA entity which has an ID and a name, and also a list of nodes, a couple of constructors and getters and setters. So pretty basic stuff, notebooks and nodes. Now let's take a look at persistence. So for each of these entities we now have a repository. So we have a node repository that handles CRUD access to the nodes, and we have a node repository that handles access to the notebooks. Again, very simple stuff. They extend the JPA repository. They might have custom methods like this find all by notebook. We pass in the notebook, but other than that, pretty default. Our application also has a database seeder, which is a command line runner. Now, if you're familiar with Spring Boot, a command line runner basically is a component that gets fired up after the Spring application starts. So this component is automatically executed. And when this component is executed, we basically clear up the database, and then we create a default notebook called default and a quotes notebook, and then we add a hello note inside the default notebook. So basically it kind of initializes our database and it puts a minimal amount of data in there so that we don't start from scratch. Also, we can notice this conditional on property here annotation, which basically says that if we have this property in our application properties file with the value of true, only then will this code get executed. So if I go to my application properties and I say noted database recreate and I set it to false, then our database will not be recreated on each run. Instead, we'll use the old version of the database, which is fine for most circumstances, except when you first fire up your app and you need to have a basic data in there. We'll just leave that to true for now. So the note, the model, and the database, pretty basic stuff. Now, we also have a mail package. Like I said, the Noted application also allows users to send feedback about the app to the administrator. If you remember back in episode 2 when we made the demo of the application, there was a feedback form, and then the user would press okay, send feedback, and a mail should arrive to the administrator. Now these are the components that manage that. So we have a feedback mail sender where we take some properties from the configuration file and we use them to send the message that the user sent in there. Now these mail properties are also defined in the application properties file. Now for testing purposes we're going to use mailtrap. I'm going to show this to you when we're actually developing the feedback form, but just know that if you want to play around with the mail configuration, that's also in the application properties file. And now for the most important part, we have the API. So like I said, our Spring Boot application serves as an API for various clients, and the Angular application is going to be one of those clients. And API basically contains the controllers. We have a node controller, that we use to grab all the nodes, to save nodes, to update nodes, and so on and so forth. We have a notebook controller, which does the same thing for notebooks. And we have the feedback controller, which, exposes one endpoint that empowers users to send feedback. Now, if you look at one of these controllers, all of them basically, sorry, this one is simpler. All of them are REST controllers. We use the request mapping annotation to prefix our routes, and then each controller has a cross-origin annotation, so each and every one of them. Now, why is that? In a normal application, the classical ones where you have the views also embedded in the backend application, basically the client side and the backend are bundled together in one app, and they live on the same domain. So you have one package, one deployable, and then the web server executes that deployable. So everything resides within the same domain. When you use Angular, if you remember, we have two applications. This one is the first one, and the Angular app is the other one. And because there are two distinct applications, they have different domains. And by default, if we delete this annotation and we try to make a request from outside the domain to this controller, it will automatically get rejected or discarded. So that's why it's important to have the cross-origin annotation on our controllers. And if you want to filter out or allow only requests from a specific domain, we can further configure this annotation. So if you want to grab more details about it, go to the Spring Boot documentation and you can see exactly how to use cross-origin. But this is very important to know if you want to build, applications where the clients are completely different instances. And like I said, we have methods to retrieve all the notebooks. We have methods to create and update notebooks, methods to delete a notebook. The same thing is happening for the nodes. So we have a method to retrieve all the nodes, a method to retrieve a node by ID, by notebook, to create and update nodes, and also a method to delete nodes. Pretty basic stuff. Okay. We also have a view model in here. So like I told you earlier, we have a node entity, but I don't want to expose that entity to our clients. So that's why we are using view models as a kind of separation of concerns. So the view model should be responsible to make a contract between the client and the server, while the model has other responsibilities like, participate in business logic flows, or, get persistent in the database. Also, I don't want to pollute my GPA entities with annotations like validation or, JSON annotations like, we might have. So these view models, although they look very similar to the to the entities, are actually here to provide separation of concerns. We can modify these view models, which means that our clients will still be able to call us, but we don't have to modify the actual model of our application, so our actual domain. And this is pretty much a good thing. And now that we are familiar with this application, let's try to run it. Okay, now you might be wondering, okay, we have this Spring Boot application, which is basically an API. How do we test it if you don't have any client? Well, you can use Postman or just Chrome and fire up requests, but there's a better way to do it, and that's the built-in REST editor that newer versions of IntelliJ IDEA have. So what you can do, you can fire up your application. You can see that our application has started on port 8082. We have initialized the database, and now, for example, we can take a look at here in the API. We have the noted HTTP file. Now, like I said, you can use JSON, or you can use Chrome or Postman to test your app, but I like to keep this documented inside HTTP files. So let's say we want to grab all the notebooks. So we have to make a call, a GET request to the notebook controller. And so we have to have something like HTTP localhost 8082, and then we need to append API notebooks, and then we need to append all. And this will make the request get handled by this method, and we will return all the notebooks. Okay, so let's go to the Note API. You can see here that we have the notebooks all, and we also have a variable here, host URL. You can find host URL here in the REST client environment JSON file. So the host URL is basically the base URL of our app. So it's HTTP localhost, and I think I should make it 8082 actually, because our application got started on this port, /API. And then we just need to append our requests accordingly. So if I hit run with dev environment, okay, we basically made a request here to API notebooks all, and then as a response we get the two notebooks that our database seeder created. So we have the default notebook and the default, and the other notebook, which is called quotes. Now let's say we want to grab the nodes. Now we also have an entry here. We can run this as well, and now we get this single note in our application, which is the hello note. And we can see ID, title, the text, the notebook ID, so the reference to the notebook that contains it, and the last modification date. And basically in this HTTP file we have all the requests that we will use from our Angular application, and you can use this HTTP file to test your app before you even start to develop the clients. And I think this is pretty much a good idea, because if your backend application is not working correctly, you will spend more time debugging afterwards, after you have Angular introduced in this pipeline. So it's pretty important to build a backend, have some requests there, test them, establish some contracts, so the view models, and then you can go to create clients for it. Now don't worry if you didn't understand this application. It's in a 100% manner. Like I told you before, we have the source code on GitHub, so you can download it and you can tweak it, you can play around with it. But basically it's just a plain old Spring Boot application that persists some data and exposes some controller. And from an Angular development perspective, we are just interested to know what we can do with it, so those methods on the controllers, and how we can access them. And because we have this HTTP file here, we kind of know what requests we need to execute. Also, if some of the concepts presented in this video are not very clear, you can check out the internet to get familiar with how Spring Boot web applications work, or you can check out my Spring Boot 101 course. I mean, if you take a look at that one and then you open up this application, you'll understand all the concepts and all the things that are stated in here. Okay, that being said, I hope you guys have a good understanding of the backend that we'll use, because in the next episodes we'll actually start to work with Angular and with integrating Angular with Spring Boot. Before we close, I would like to remind you to subscribe to this channel and stay tuned for more software development tutorials that will sharpen your programming skills. Just go to the Romanian Coder YouTube page and click on the subscribe button. Also, if you found this video useful, please hit the like button and share it with your friends. If you have any comments, thoughts, or ideas for new courses, just put them in the comment section at the end of this video, because I would love to get feedback from you guys. You can also find me on Twitter at Romanian Coder, and you can also check out my blog www.romaniancoder.com. Until next time, have a great day and write amazing code. Goodbye.